1 week ago, the world stared in horror at Sandy Hook Elementary. Innocent lives shattered by a man who has been called sick, disturbed, depraved. Could his actions also be called evil? Joining us now with their perspectives, Father Thomas Rosica, priest at the Congregation of St. Basil in Toronto and CEO at the Salt and Light Catholic Media Foundation, and Jordan Peterson, professor of psychology at the University of Toronto. And it's good of both of you gentlemen to be with us tonight for what will no doubt be an uncomfortable conversation, but let's see how we do. You probably saw in this past week's Globe and Mail on Tuesday an op-ed piece by Rabbi John Moskowitz from Holy Blossom Temple. I want to quote just a little bit of this here, where he wrote, "Most everywhere you turn these past few days, the horrifying killing of 26 people, primarily small children, is pronounced, quote, a tragedy. It isn't a tragedy. It's evil. Even once the killer is determined to be ill, there's no avoiding that the unspeakable massacre of Newtown was born of human evil." Let's start there. Father, do you agree that this was an act of evil?
I certainly agree with Rabbi Moskowitz, and I'm very glad that he wrote what he did and said it so clearly. We have in our day and age, we try to whitewash terrible events using words as tragedy, victim. We use words, has a mental illness or whatever, but let's go right back to the source. This is the power of evil that visited Sandy Hook and that school last Friday. There's no question in my mind, and I'm glad that Rabbi Moskowitz said what he did.
No question in your mind. Is there any question in your mind?
No, I think that that's true. I think that you need terminology like good and evil to discuss a situation like this properly.
Even if mental illness were involved, we don't know that yet, but if it were involved, you'd still want to say this was evil?
That's a question I always like to reverse, like you, in a sense, you can excuse people's actions by using terminology associated with mental illness, but the big problem with that is that you tar mentally ill people with that brush then. There isn't a tremendous amount of evidence that mentally ill people are, on average, any more violent than normal people.
In fact, I think the contrary is true.
Yeah, often. So, it does mentally ill people no service to pass off or to excuse the actions of somebody who is depraved using that terminology. Plus, I don't think it's a good causal explanation anyways, because he planned this, and there's no lack of foresight, and you can be sure he was thinking about it for a very, very long time. And then there's the massacre of innocence element of it, which to me is a hallmark of an act that's particularly evil.
Father Thomas, we have heard, though, the word tragedy used over and over and over again, as if that somehow can appropriately sum this up. Why do you think that's a particularly inappropriate word to use?
First of all, we need to go back, as Rabbi Moskowitz said, and recapture the meaning of tragedy, which comes to us from the Greek world of theater, to be precise. Tragedy is the result of something that happens. Evil is a power that overtakes people who are also capable of doing great things, distorts, ruins, kills that person himself or herself, and that person is capable of wreaking havoc and evil around him. One of the difficulties we have in our age is we don't like to use such words as evil. We exalt, as Rabbi Moskowitz said, we exalt the human person, and we think this person cannot be capable of wreaking havoc because we know another side. But the mysterium iniquitatis, which is at the heart of this, the mystery of evil, takes over a person. This person goes and kills his mother 4 times, shooting her in the head. This person then goes into a school of innocents and destroys them. It's easy in the first moments of the killing. When I was watching the news last week, we heard, oh, this person is suffering from autism or from Asperger's syndrome. And the first thing that came to me after the revulsion of what happened, is all of those people with Asperger's syndrome or autism that I know and have had the privilege of working with, who are among the most peaceful people I know, because they've dealt with the demons. They take medication and they've adapted themselves to society. This is a young man, 20 years old. God knows how much he premeditated these actions. God knows how much he was disturbed in himself, and it's far too easy to try to justify every single action that we do by family problems, by difficulties. All of those things are part of a composite picture. Nevertheless, the power of evil set its feet down in that beautiful little town last week. And we're paying the price for it right now.
Do you think the use of the word tragedy is inappropriate in this case?
Earthquake's a tragedy. There's a lack of the notion of will in tragedy. Like, I mean, it was a tragedy for the families, obviously. It's a tragedy for the community. But to think of the event itself as a tragedy, it's not the right way of conceptualizing it. And part of the reason is, like, I thought a lot about definitions of evil, and the best definition I've been able to formulate is the perpetration of suffering for its own sake. So there's not even hypothetically any positive outcome of this sequence of events. You know, sometimes when terrible things happen, people justify it by saying, well, I was aiming at a good end. There's no good end here. All that happened was that this person set out to produce as much pointless suffering as possible in the shortest period of time for the least possible reason.
Is the fact that he committed suicide at the end of it all,
it's the capstone.
I'm looking for, this is not the right word, but you know, you being who you are and doing what you do for a living,
Yeah.
do you have that much iota of sympathy for him?
No.
No, nothing there.
No, I don't have very much sympathy for him, because it's a obscene gesture, that post-murderous suicide, because what it does is it deprives anyone of any explanation. It eradicates any hope of justice on the part of the victims, and it signifies to the world that the person who committed this event has so little regard for human life that they're perfectly willing to demonstrate to everyone that they have zero value for their own being after killing all sorts of other people who had nothing to do with their problems. So it's part of the dramatic event, because the suicide is the final demonstration that the person's judgment that being is not worth sustaining is a serious and deep judgment.
If this is, as you have described it, an act of evil, and if, because he killed himself, he doesn't have a chance to confess or repent for what he has done, can you give us some insight into how the church sees what's going to happen to this guy's soul? What happens to him now? Adam Lanza.
Adam Lanza and his mother were both Catholics. They were members of St. Rose of Lima Church, this church which is at the epicenter of what's happening there this week, the funerals, the wonderful priest who's been the pastor for the nation during this crisis. The church has never spoken about the presence of people in hell. The church has never said that so-and-so is in hell. The church has said that many people are in heaven. That's why we have the doctrine of the saints and the wonderful presence of saints and blesseds in the church. Nevertheless, in a case like this, the mystery remains, the question remains, and what we must do is pray for this person's soul and pray for his mother, pray for all of those who were part of his life. We don't know where Adam Lanza is, but somehow in the mystery of God, there is a place for Adam Lanza. What will happen to Adam Lanza as he stands before the throne of God and he is rendering an account for what he did with these short years of his life?
But do you believe that,
we don't know that.
Do you believe that if there is a hell, it's meant for people like him?
I won't say that. I will say that he's given us many indications, especially through this last bit of his life, that he's not chosen the power of God's mercy and the power of God's love. But we also heard some testimony from his friends on television this past week that he was a quiet kid, he had some personality disorders or difficulties, but no one could imagine what he did in the final moments of his life. And therein lies the mystery of judgment. It's not up to us, ultimately. It is between the person and God. And I prayed for him, and I prayed for his mother, and I agree with Professor Peterson that the final act of suicide is the ultimate statement of selfishness and a lack of concern for the havoc and the wake that you leave in your going.
Jordan, let me try this with you as we try to understand how wide we can cast the net over this evil act. Yes, he took the shots, but he used something that was made by gun manufacturers. He used something that was freely available thanks to the gun lobby in the United States. He used something that the gun lobby was successful with because Congress has declined to act for a whole bunch of reasons on this issue. If this was an act of evil, can we say that there are lots of other people who participated in this act of evil, even tangentially?
Well, I would say that without necessarily making reference to any one group. I mean, people's lives are touched by acts of evil and acts of good on the part of everyone around them. You know, and like the way that you regard your own life is shaped to some degree by the benevolence or the malevolence of the people around you. And so his life in some ways is going to be the sum total of his interactions with other people. I don't buy, like, sociological explanations for me for acts like this don't ever really hold water. I think that it's actually quite reprehensible for people to use an event like this to put forward whatever their particular political platform is, because I think, especially when you're talking about something like evil, you're not talking about a sociological phenomenon.
So it's wrong for the president to put together a Biden-led panel to study what possible legal changes should
It
make
isn't
here?
the president so much I'm speaking about, because he has such a weight of responsibility that, you know, I think you'd have to be a fool to judge what he feels impelled to do in the aftermath of an event like this. But one of the things I see happening instantaneously is that when an event like this unfolds, people use it as an excuse to ratchet forward their a priori political concerns, you know, as if they were waiting for the excuse to have a little more moral force to push forward what they're doing. I'm sure that gun manufacturers have evil and good impulses like everyone else. And if a good-evil distinction isn't necessarily the basis for a policy analysis.
Okay. Would you cast the net wide to include people in Congress who declined to engage in gun control legislation, or gun manufacturers, or the NRA?
Very interesting point, because in the Catholic moral theological tradition, there is always the place of cooperation in evil, where I agree with you that we should not use this as now the rally to change completely gun control. That's one small factor of the issue. The president on Sunday at that very moving prayer service, the interfaith prayer service in Connecticut, really went to the heart of the issue. He didn't address gun control as much as he said we've let down our children. There's something wrong in the family structure here. He went to the heart of the matter and said, we've got to rethink this whole thing. I've been president for 4 years, and we've had 4 major disasters where evil visited our land. We think of the theater in Colorado. We think of the University of Virginia, where the shooting took place. We think of last year at a political rally where an innocent political official was shot, almost killed, and other people died. Abby Giffords.
In Arizona.
And so what does this tell us about the deeper issue of where are our families? Where are our children? The absent fathers in so many of these situations. The images that our kids are getting off the internet or off television, playing war games and everything else, those are far more important. The gun control issue must be addressed. But to simply say, okay, folks, this was our point de départ. Now we're going to launch against Congress and go against all of these officials. We're caught up in a cycle of evil, and we don't realize that we're all cooperating in these terrible things.
Sounds to me like you want to cast the net even wider then.
Much wider.
Much wider.
Much wider, and go to the heart of our children. This is Christmas. This is a week when people should have been celebrating and rejoicing. And not only Connecticut, but the entire country and the world has been caught up in this cycle of violence because evil visited an innocent area.
Jordan, you want to follow?
Well, I spent a lot of time in my life reading about malevolent acts, and most of the ones that I studied deeply were part of what happened in Nazi Germany or in the Soviet Union. And there's been a remarkable concurrence of opinion about the causes of those sorts of terrible events among people who've thought deeply about them. And I think the greatest thinker I ever encountered in relationship to evil was probably Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who wrote about the Soviet Gulag archipelago and the 60 million people who died in Soviet repression. And what Solzhenitsyn concluded after he'd meditated on those sorts of acts for decades was that if you're talking about evil, you're talking about something that is firmly within the realm of individual personal responsibility. And so when I see an act that's clearly evil, and I would say that's one that involves choice and that involves the sacrifice of innocence for the purpose of producing suffering, I think the right response to that, and I think the only response that'll work in the long run to minimize it, is for people to consider how it is that they're operating within the confines of their own life, and to try to understand if the acts that they undertake as individuals in the world day to day are the sort of acts that make that sort of thing more likely or less likely. Now, here's a classic example. I talked to a panel of people at CBC once about this after one of these shootings. Because one of the things that happens with media coverage of events like this is that the killer gets glorified and gets a tremendous amount of extremely valuable advertising.
It's one killer's name to remember. See,
Right, it's easy.
As opposed to 28 victims,
these
27
well,
victims.
right, and these people are competitive.
Yeah.
And so I would say, well, the sort of community evil that fosters this sort of act is the act that someone who's wondering how to cover a story like this, they're grappling with that in their conscience, and they make the decision to capitalize on the killer's name in the hope that it'll make the story more saleable. That's the little kind of evil act that someone would undertake in their day-to-day existence that would contribute in the long run to increasing the probability that something like this would happen again. And there's lots of little things that happen like that all the time that set the stage for an event like this, and they happen in the confines of people's own lives.
Father, I'm interested actually in the fact that both of you have not hesitated to call this what I haven't seen much discussion, frankly, about in the past week, and that is you are calling it for what it is. You are both saying this is evil. And most people that I've seen on television talk about this, either the tragedy or awful events or appalling this and that. Few people I have seen are prepared to call it what you two have called it. And I wonder why that is in the kind of liberal, democratic, Western value society that we live in. People are so unwilling to use that word to describe this. Why do you think?
That's a good question, Steve. I think for the past 50 years, I can speak of that period, which I know quite well. We've done everything we could to call evil or sinfulness by other names. And by doing that, we never address the situation. We skirt around it. Blessed John Paul II, Pope John Paul II, that you knew well and I knew well, he said we must never call sin by any other name than what it is. And we must never call evil by anything else than what it is. And not to be afraid to say that. Because when we try to masquerade it, to obfuscate it, to change it, to soften it, we're not dealing with the reality, and we do havoc to the victims, the innocent victims.
Why do we do that, though? Why do we want to soften
because we would
evil
like
when
to
we
be
see
nice. And I think the political correctness of our recent times has distorted truth, images, vocabulary, and behavior. And that's really a great part of this. I encounter it every day in the work that I do. Oh no, we can't say that, or you can't name this, or don't use the word evil, and please don't speak about the devil if it's some little guy dressed up with a red suit and horns and a pitchfork. I'm talking about the blatant, ugly face of evil that rears its head now and then. And what it does is make us reflect on our motives, on our behavior, on our actions, and to really go to the heart of what we are and what we do, and how much reviling and hatred and destruction is at work within us. And unless we address those situations, we do no good for humanity. And especially when we wear clothes like I'm wearing in the name of religion. We must name things for what they are.
Jordan?
Well, I think there are, I agree with what the father said, essentially. But I also think that there are good reasons to be wary of the word evil. It's a really useful and simple category to put other people in if you don't agree with them. And so although its abandonment is inappropriate because it's a word that has technical utility, it also has to be used very sparingly. And I think you should be very skeptical of people who use words like good and evil when they're talking about making radical changes in other people's lives. Like, to me, the only framework of evaluation that justifies good-evil terminology is one that involves the person who's using the terminology in simultaneous deep consideration of their own moral stance. So if you're talking about this shooting and you're describing it as evil, if there isn't a part of you that's being analyzed at the same time as the killer is being analyzed, then, well, you're holier than thou. And I would say in some senses, you've committed a sin of pride, and that propels you towards developing the same kind of motivations that the killer would have been meditating on and developing for hundreds of hours before an act like this.
I'm glad you said that, because I agree fully with you. Oftentimes, evil is a word that's easily used to dismiss people. I don't like what you stand for, I don't like what you represent, therefore you're evil, you're unorthodox, you're on this, on that. I'm talking about the power of evil which comes and wreaks havoc. A power of evil which takes over in a town last week. It takes over a kid's life, a young man, and he wreaks havoc. And that's the massive power of evil. It's another thing to disagree with somebody. But what we have to do, we lose the image of charity which must govern our activities.
I got 20 seconds left here. Can any good come out of this evil?
Tremendous good. What we're seeing right now, only God is capable of making beautiful things come out of such horrific evil. Watching the outpouring of concern, of charity, of kindness, watching that priest, Monsignor Robert Weiss, priests have taken a lot of hits the past while, but to watch what this priest has done, a pastor in that town, he's become a pastor for the nation, and I'm deeply moved and grateful that he's showing us just being there is enough, because there are no words.
And we thank you, Father Tom and Jordan, for being here today to share your views on this. Thanks so much to you both.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.